I spent 6 months at a child reform school before it shut down. It still haunts me to this day. I don't sleep well anymore. Haven't for decades, really. My wife Elaine has grown used to my midnight wanderings, the way I check the locks 3 times before bed, how I flinch at certain sounds, the click of dress shoes on hardwood, the creak of a door opening slowly. She stopped asking about the nightmares that leave me gasping and sweat-soaked in the dark hours before dawn. She's good that way, knows when to let something lie. But some things shouldn't stay buried. I'm 64 years old now. The doctors say my heart isn't what it used to be. I've survived 1 minor attack already, and the medication they've got me on makes my hands shake like I've got Parkinson's. If I'm going to tell this story, it has to be now, before whatever's left of my memories gets scrambled by age or death or the bottles of whiskey I still use to keep the worst of the recollections at bay. This is about Blackwood Reform School for Boys, and what happened during my 6 months there in 1974. What really happened, not what the newspapers reported, not what the official records show. I need someone to know the truth before I die. Maybe then I'll be able to sleep. My name is Thaddeus Mitchell. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Connecticut, the kind of place where people kept their lawns mowed and their problems hidden. My father worked for an insurance company, wore the same gray suit every day, came home at 5:30 on the dot. My mother taught piano to neighborhood kids, served on the PTA, and made pot roast on Sundays. They were decent people, trying their best in the aftermath of the cultural upheaval of the 60s to raise a son who wouldn't embarrass them. I failed them spectacularly. It started small, shoplifting candy bars from the corner store, skipping school to hang out behind the bowling alley with older kids who had cigarettes and beer. Then came the spray-painted obscenities on Mr. Abernathy's garage door. He'd reported me for stealing his newspaper, followed by the punch I threw at Principal Danning when he caught me smoking in the bathroom. By 13, I'd acquired what the court called a pattern of escalating delinquent behavior. The judge who sentenced me, Judge Harmon, with his steel gray hair and eyes like chips of ice, was a believer in the scared straight philosophy. He gave my parents a choice: 6 months at Blackwood Reform School or juvenile detention followed by probation until I was 18. They chose Blackwood. The brochure made it look like a prestigious boarding school, with its stately Victorian architecture and promises of rehabilitation through structure, discipline, and vocational training. My father said it would be good for me, would make a man of me. If he only knew what kind of men Blackwood made. The day my parents drove me there remains etched in my memory: the long, winding driveway through acres of dense pine forest, the main building looming ahead, all red brick and sharp angles against the autumn sky, the 10-foot fence topped with coils of gleaming razor wire that seemed at odds with the school's dignified facade. My mother cried when we parked, asked if I wanted her to come inside. I was too angry to say yes, even though every instinct screamed not to let her leave. My father shook my hand formally, told me to make the most of this opportunity. I watched their Buick disappear down the driveway, swallowed by the trees. It was the last time I'd see them for 6 months. Sometimes I wonder if I'd ever truly seen them before that, or if they'd ever truly seen me. Headmaster Thorne met me at the entrance, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes and skin so pale it seemed translucent in certain light. His handshake was cold and dry, like touching paper. He spoke with an accent I couldn't place, something European but indistinct, as if deliberately blurred around the edges. "Welcome to Blackwood, young man," he said, those dark eyes never quite meeting mine. "We have a long and distinguished history of reforming boys such as yourself. Some of our most successful graduates arrived in much the same state as you: angry, defiant, lacking direction. They left as pillars of their communities." He didn't elaborate on what kind of communities those were. The intake process was clinical and humiliating: strip search, delousing shower, institutional clothing, gray slacks, white button-up shirts, black shoes that pinched my toes. They took my watch, my wallet, the Swiss Army knife my grandfather had given me, saying I'd get them back when I left. I never saw any of it again. My assigned room was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a narrow cell with 2 iron-framed beds, a shared dresser, and a small window that overlooked the exercise yard. My roommate was Marcus Reed, a lanky kid from Boston with quick eyes and a crooked smile that didn't quite reach them. He'd been at Blackwood for 4 months already, sent there for joyriding in his uncle's Cadillac. "You'll get used to it," he told me that first night, voice low even though we were alone. "Just keep your head down, don't ask questions, and never, ever be alone with Dr. Faust." I asked who Dr. Faust was. "The school physician," Marcus said, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to be listening. "He likes to experiment. Says he's collecting data on adolescent development or some bullshit. Just try to stay healthy." The daily routine was mind-numbingly rigid: wake at 5:30 a.m., make beds to military precision, hygiene and dress inspection at 6 o'clock, breakfast at 6:30. Classes from 7:30 to noon, covering the basics but with an emphasis on moral education and industrial skills. Lunch, followed by 4 hours of work assignments, kitchen duty, groundskeeping, laundry, maintenance. Dinner at 6 o'clock, mandatory study hall from 7 to 9 o'clock, lights out at 9:30. There were approximately 40 boys at Blackwood when I arrived, ranging in age from 12 to 17. Some were genuine troublemakers, violence in their eyes, prison tattoos already on their knuckles despite their youth. Others were like me, ordinary kids who'd made increasingly bad choices. A few seemed out of place entirely, too timid and well-behaved for a reform school. I later learned these were the private placements, boys whose wealthy parents had paid Headmaster Thorne directly to take their embarrassing problems off their hands. Homosexuality, drug use, political radicalism, things that good families couldn't abide in the early 70s. The staff consisted of Headmaster Thorne, 6 teachers, all men, all with the same hollow-eyed look, 4 guards called supervisors, a cook, a groundskeeper, and Dr. Faust. The doctor was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and meticulously groomed salt and pepper hair. His hands were always clean, nails perfectly trimmed. He spoke with the same unidentifiable accent as Headmaster Thorne. The first indication that something was wrong at Blackwood came 3 weeks after my arrival. Clayton Wheeler, a quiet 15-year-old who kept to himself, was found dead at the bottom of the main staircase, his neck broken. The official explanation was that he'd fallen while trying to sneak downstairs after lights out. But I'd seen Clayton the evening before, hunched over a notebook in the library, writing frantically. When I'd approached him to ask about a history assignment, he'd slammed the notebook shut and hurried away, looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. I mentioned this to one of the supervisors, a younger man named Aldrich who seemed more human than the others. He'd thanked me, promised to look into it. The notebook was never found. Aldrich disappeared 2 weeks later. The official story was that he'd quit suddenly, moved west for a better opportunity. But Emmett Dawson, who worked in the administrative office as part of his work assignment, saw Aldrich's belongings in a box in Headmaster Thorne's office: family photos, clothes, even his wallet and keys. No one leaves without their wallet. Emmett disappeared 3 days after telling me about the box. Then Marcus went missing. My roommate, who'd been counting down the days until his release, excited about the welcome home party his mother was planning. The night before he vanished, he shook me awake around midnight, his face pale in the moonlight slanting through our window. "Thad," he whispered, "I need to tell you something. Last night I couldn't sleep, so I went to get a drink of water. I saw them taking someone down to the basement. Wheeler wasn't an accident. They're doing something to us, man. I don't know what, but..." The sound of footsteps in the hallway cut him off, the distinctive click-clack of dress shoes on hardwood. Marcus dove back into his bed, pulled the covers up. The footsteps stopped outside our door, lingered, moved on. When I woke the next morning, Marcus was gone. His bed was already stripped, as if he'd never been there. When I asked where he was, I was told he'd been released early for good behavior. But his clothes were still in our dresser. His mother's letters, with their excited plans for his homecoming, were still tucked under his mattress. No one seemed concerned. No police came to investigate. When I tried to talk to other boys about it, they turned away, suddenly busy with something else. The fear in their eyes was answer enough. After Marcus, they moved in Silas Hargrove, a pale, freckled boy with a stutter who barely spoke above a whisper. He'd been caught breaking into summer homes along Lake Champlain, though he didn't seem the type. He told me his father had lost his job, and they'd been living in their car. The break-ins were to find food and warmth, not to steal. "I just wanted us somewhere to sleep," he said one night. Somewhere warm. Blackwood was warm, but it wasn't safe. Silas disappeared within a week. By then, I'd started noticing other things, the way certain areas of the building were always locked, despite being listed as classrooms or storage on the floor plans. The way some staff members appeared in school photographs dating back decades, unchanged. The sounds at night, furniture being moved in the basement, muffled voices in languages I didn't recognize, screams quickly silenced. The smell that sometimes wafted through the heating vents, metallic and sickly sweet, like blood and decay. I began keeping a journal, hiding it in a loose floorboard beneath my bed. I documented everything: names, dates, inconsistencies in the staff stories. I drew maps of the building, marking areas that were restricted and times when they were left unguarded. I wasn't sure what I was collecting evidence of, only that something was deeply wrong at Blackwood, and someone needed to know. My new roommate after Silas was Wyatt Blackburn, a heavy-set boy with dead eyes who'd been transferred from a juvenile detention center in Pennsylvania. Unlike the others, Wyatt was genuinely disturbing. He collected dead insects, arranging them in patterns on his windowsill. He watched me while I slept. He had long, whispered conversations with himself when he thought I wasn't listening. "They're choosing," he told me once, out of nowhere. "Separating the wheat from the chaff. Your wheat, Mitchell. Special. They've been watching you." I asked who they were. He just smiled, showing teeth that seemed too small, too numerous. The old ones. The ones who've always been here. Then he laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Don't worry. It's an honor to be chosen. I became more cautious after that, watching the patterns, looking for a way out. The fence was too high, topped with razor wire. The forest beyond was miles of wilderness. The only phone was in Headmaster Thorne's office, and mail was read before being sent out. But I kept planning, kept watching. The basement became the focus of my attention. Whatever was happening at Blackwood, the basement was central to it. Staff would escort selected boys down there for specialized therapy sessions. Those boys would return quiet, compliant, their eyes vacant. Some didn't return at all. December brought heavy snow, blanketing the grounds and making the old building creak and groan as temperatures plummeted. The heating system struggled, leaving our rooms cold enough to see our breath. Extra blankets were distributed, scratchy wool things that smelled of mothballs and something else, something that made me think of hospital disinfectant. It was during this cold snap that I made my discovery. My work assignment that month was maintenance, which meant I spent hours with Mr. Weiss, the ancient groundskeeper, fixing leaky pipes and replacing blown fuses. Weiss rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with that same unplaceable accent as Thorne and Faust. We were repairing a burst pipe in one of the first-floor bathrooms when Weiss was called away to deal with an issue in the boiler room. He told me to wait, but as soon as he was gone, I began exploring. The bathroom was adjacent to one of the locked areas, and I'd noticed a ventilation grate near the floor that might connect them. The grate came away easily, the screws loose with age. Behind it was a narrow duct, just large enough for a skinny 13-year-old to squeeze through. I didn't hesitate, this might be my only chance to see what they were hiding. The duct led to another grate, this one overlooking what appeared to be a laboratory. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with specimens floating in cloudy fluid, organs, tissue samples, things I couldn't identify. Metal tables gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. One held what looked like medical equipment, scalpels, forceps, things with blades and teeth whose purpose I could only guess at. Another held a body. I couldn't see the face from my angle, just the bare feet, one with a small butterfly tattoo on the ankle. I recognized that tattoo Emmett Dawson had gotten it in honor of his little sister, who'd died of leukemia. The door to the laboratory opened, and Dr. Faust entered, followed by Headmaster Thorne and another man I didn't recognize, tall, blonde, with the same hollow eyes as the rest of the staff. They were speaking that language again, the one I couldn't identify. Faust gestured to the body, pointing out something I couldn't see. The blonde man nodded, made a note on a clipboard. Thorne said something that made the others laugh, a sound like ice cracking. Then they were moving toward the body, Faust reaching for one of the gleaming instruments. I backed away from the grate so quickly I nearly gave myself away, banging my elbow against the metal duct. I froze, heart pounding, certain they'd heard. But no alarm was raised. I squirmed backward until I reached the bathroom, replaced the grate with shaking hands, and was sitting innocently on a supply bucket when Weiss returned. That night, I lay awake long after lights out, listening to Wyatt's wet, snuffling breaths from the next bed. I knew I had to escape, not just for my sake, but to tell someone what was happening. The problem was evidence. No one would believe a delinquent teenager without proof. The next day, I stole a camera from the photography club. It was an old Kodak, nothing fancy, but it had half a roll of film left. I needed to get back to that laboratory, to document what I'd seen. I also needed my journal, names, dates, everything I'd recorded. Together, they might be enough to convince someone to investigate. My opportunity came during the Christmas break. Most of the boys went home for the holidays, but about a dozen of us had nowhere to go, parents who didn't want us, or, in my case, parents who'd been told it was therapeutically inadvisable to interrupt my rehabilitation process. The reduced population meant fewer staff on duty, less supervision. The night of December 23rd, I waited until the midnight bed check was complete. Wyatt was gone, he'd been taken for one of those therapy sessions that afternoon and hadn't returned. I had the room to myself. I retrieved my journal from its hiding place, tucked the camera into my waistband, and slipped into the dark hallway. The building was quiet except for the omnipresent creaking of old wood and the hiss of the radiators. I made my way down the service stairs at the far end of the east wing, avoiding the main staircase where a night supervisor was usually stationed. My plan was to enter the laboratory through the same ventilation duct, take my photographs, and be back in bed before the 3 a.m. bed check. I never made it that far. As I reached the first-floor landing, I heard voices, Thorne and Faust, speaking English this time, their words echoing up the stairwell from below. The latest batch is promising, Faust was saying. Particularly the Mitchell boy. His resistance to the initial treatments is most unusual. You're certain? Thorne's voice, skeptical. The blood work confirms it. He has the markers we've been looking for. With the proper conditioning, he could be most useful. And the others? A dismissive sound from Faust. Failed subjects. We'll process them tomorrow. The Hargrove boy yielded some interesting tissue samples, but nothing remarkable. The Reed boy's brain showed potential, but degraded too quickly after extraction. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a sob, something, because the conversation stopped abruptly. Then came the sound of dress shoes on the stairs below me, coming up. Click-clack, click-clack. I ran. Not back to my room, they'd look there first, but toward the administrative offices. Emmett had once mentioned that one of the windows in the file room had a broken lock. If I could get out that way, make it to the fence where the snow had drifted high enough to reach the top, maybe I had a chance. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it, a high, keening sound, like a hunting horn but wrong somehow, discordant. It echoed through the building, and in its wake came other sounds, doors opening, footsteps from multiple directions, voices calling in that strange language. The hunt was on. I reached the file room, fumbled in the dark for the window. The lock was indeed broken, but the window was painted shut. I could hear them getting closer, the click-clack of dress shoes, the heavier tread of the supervisor's boots. I grabbed a metal paperweight from the desk and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered outward, cold air rushing in. As I was climbing through, something caught my ankle, a hand, impossibly cold, its grip like iron. I kicked back wildly, connected with something solid. The grip loosened just enough for me to pull free, tumbling into the snow outside. The ground was 3 feet below, the snow deep enough to cushion my fall. I floundered through it toward the fence, the frigid air burning my lungs. Behind me, the broken window filled with figures, Thorn, Faust, others, their faces pale blurs in the moonlight. That horn sound came again, and this time it was answered by something in the woods beyond the fence, a howl that was not a wolf, not anything I could identify. The sound chilled me more than the winter night. I reached the fence where the snow had drifted against it, forming a ramp nearly to the top. The razor wire gleamed above, waiting to tear me apart. I had no choice. I threw my journal over first, then the camera, and began to climb. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory. I remember the bite of the wire, the warm wetness of blood freezing on my skin. I remember falling on the other side, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I remember running through the woods, the snow reaching my knees, branches whipping at my face. And I remember the pursuit, not just behind me but on all sides, moving between the trees with impossible speed, the light of flashlights bobbing in the darkness. That same horn call, closer now. The answering howls, also closer. I found a road eventually, a rural highway, deserted in the middle of the night 2 days before Christmas. I followed it, stumbling, my clothes torn and crusted with frozen blood. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when headlights appeared behind me. I should have hidden, it could have been them, searching for their escaped subject. But I was too cold, too exhausted. I stood in the middle of the road and waited, ready to surrender, to die, anything to end the desperate flight. It was a state police cruiser. The officer, a burly man named Kowalski, was stunned to find a half-frozen teenager on a remote highway at dawn. I told him everything, showed him my journal, the camera. He didn't believe me, not really, but he took me to the hospital in the nearest town. I had hypothermia, dozens of lacerations from the razor wire, 2 broken fingers from my fall. While I was being treated, Officer Kowalski called my parents. He also, thankfully, called his superior officers about my allegations. What happened next was a blur of questioning, disbelief, and finally, a reluctant investigation. By the time the police reached Blackwood, much had changed. The laboratory I discovered was a storage room, filled with old desks and textbooks. Many records were missing or obviously altered. Several staff members, including Thorn and Faust, were nowhere to be found. But they did find evidence enough to raise serious concerns. Blood on the basement floor that didn't match any known staff or student. Personal effects of missing boys hidden in a locked cabinet in Thorn's office. Financial irregularities suggesting payments far beyond tuition. And most damning, a hidden room behind the boiler, containing medical equipment and what forensics would later confirm were human remains. The school was shut down immediately. The remaining boys were sent home or to other facilities. A full investigation was launched, but it never reached a satisfying conclusion. The official report cited severe institutional negligence and evidence of criminal misconduct by certain staff members. There were no arrests, the key figures had vanished. My parents were horrified, of course. Not just by what had happened to me, but by their role in sending me there. Our relationship was strained for years afterward. I had nightmares, behavioral problems, trust issues. I spent my teens in and out of therapy. The official diagnosis was PTSD, but the medications they prescribed never touched the real problem, the knowledge of what I'd seen, what had nearly happened to me. The story made the papers briefly, then faded away. Reform schools were already becoming obsolete, and Blackwood was written off as an extreme example of why such institutions needed to be replaced. The building itself burned down in 1977, an act of arson never solved. I tried to move on. I finished high school, went to community college, eventually became an accountant. I married Elaine in 1983, had 2 daughters who never knew the full story of their father's time at Blackwood. I built a normal life, or a reasonable facsimile of one. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. Never stopped checking the locks 3 times before bed. Never stopped flinching at the sound of dress shoes on hardwood. Because sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I still hear that horn call. And sometimes, when I travel for work, I catch glimpses of familiar faces in unfamiliar places, a man with deep-set eyes at a gas station in Ohio, a small man with wire-rimmed glasses at an airport in Florida. They're older, just as I am, but still recognizable. Still watching. Last year, my daughter sent my grandson to a summer camp in Vermont. When I saw the brochure, with its pictures of a stately Maine building surrounded by pine forest, I felt the old panic rising. I made her withdraw him, made up a story about the camp's safety record. I couldn't tell her the truth, that one of the smiling counselors in the background of one photo had a familiar face, unchanged despite the decades. That the camp director's name was an anagram of Thorn. They're still out there. Still operating. Still separating the wheat from the chaff. Still processing the failed subjects. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I truly escaped that night. If this life I'd built is real, or just the most elaborate conditioning of all, a comforting illusion while whatever remains of the real Thaddeus Mitchell floats in a specimen jar in some new laboratory, in some new Blackwood, under some new name. I don't sleep well anymore. But I keep checking the locks. I keep watching. And now, I've told my story. Perhaps that will be enough. But I doubt it.